love the two of you to just describe each other's congregations a little bit, because again, I think there's a lot here that's wonderfully rich. And then to invite you into a conversation around stories in your own context of how you are learning or continuing to learn how to listen and attend and to discern where God is in the midst of all of this. Part of our experience is that we want to continue to, particularly in the journal, push into how we attend to the stories of what's actually happening and going on, rather than come up with these principles and concepts. I think the second piece is that this deep sense that it's in attending to the stories of people amongst us that we get really a sense of what God is doing and where God's agency is present, rather than us as leaders sort of reading about something somewhere and trying to promulgate it now. So that's the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. And so I feel, and I mean this, I feel honored to have the both of you, because you are very grounded and live your stories. But why don't each of you, Tim, why don't you begin? Describe a little bit about Grandview Calvary and its ethos. And I know Sally is never shy for questions, and neither are you. So
Yeah.
let's get going. Yeah. Describe a bit.
Well, it's true. Just to say that one of the things we often do in our worship is interview people about their life. And people say that that's one of my better gifts. And so, Sally, I'm got some questions ready for you too. So, yeah. So, I mean, you were there, so you got a sense of what our worship is like. And I mean, because I've been there a long time, the church has gone through various kind of stages of its life. And the way I sometimes describe it is to say the first 10 years were really about becoming a church. I came with as a kind of a project of the denomination to see if there was a way we could help bring renewal to churches on the east side that were floundering, and interviewed people and tried to help the 40, 50 people there, mostly seniors, how to rediscover the neighborhood. And then we kind of went through a visioning process. A few years later, we moved we'd been living in the neighborhood, started to make friends with people and invite them to church. And it was mostly people who weren't Christians, because the church was so whacked out that Christians would come and not stay and so forth. And so that was the formational time. And there was a real richness in that, because it was, I mean, early on, we were very diverse culturally and ethnically. And because it was still an entrance point for a lot of people in Vancouver, our neighborhood, and we reflected that. In fact, we still reflect our neighborhood, but our neighborhood is gentrified and become more Caucasian, and so it's actually felt like a loss in some senses for us in that way. But so we kind of formed a community in that time, and I was learning to be a pastor. I was 26 when I came, so I was learning to be a pastor. And then the next 10 years were really about after we got kind of healthy, we were about engaging our neighborhood in much deeper ways. And that was happening along the way, but we started to develop a lot of different initiatives and organizations and ways of engaging our neighborhood, from, a meal on Thursday night and shelter, to housing, community housing, to social enterprises, to housing and support for refugee claimants and so forth. And so we started to develop some of these things. And then the last 10 years have been about continuing that work, but in some ways it's about us having become more permeable, I feel like, to the neighborhood. And I wrote a paper a while back about how do we become more public about the gospel, not just in the sense of trying to evangelize people, but how do we declare what God is doing among us, and that has been a work we've continued to press the edges on, of how do we name that work. And so that's kind of a broad story, but again, we've gentrified a lot, and so now the neighborhood is more polarized, where there used to be a spectrum of people. Now we have poor people, about 25% of the housing is subsidized or older housing that's still kind of cheap, and then you got $2 million homes, and so it's that polarized, and our church reflects that too. Generally, we have people with some money, and then we have people with nothing, and we're trying to find our way together. And our recent housing development, the 26 units has mixed people together, reflects that too. It's mostly people low income, but then there's some people with more income choosing to live there to be a part of that kind of neighborhood. So that's the short version.
Well, what's fascinating and really wonderful is that you took a parking lot, which itself is a symbol of a whole lot of things, right? And built. It's social housing, is it, Tim?
Yep.
So that you've got different mixed incomes, but people living in a sense of community. It's a beautiful building in terms of what it's been done. Yeah.
It is. Turned out well. They had their 1-year anniversary last night. So.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Nice.
Yeah. And Sally, Bonnie, do.
Super encouragement, and there are some similarities. So the East End of London is typically working class, but very diverse. So probably in terms of like multiracial mix, it's very, very mixed. So I think Newham is one of the most diverse boroughs in the world. We really are a melting pot of different nationalities. But the part of East Ham that we're in has still got a fair amount of old white working class families and that kind of culture. And they're one of the hardest people groups to reach, apparently, in terms of connecting the church and the gospel. So our church is quite unusual because we have quite a lot of working class men as part of the church. And as well as it's really a broad spread of ages and ethnicities. And we do have some gentrification coming into our part of the borough. So we've got some more kind of professional families, but not many. I think what was interesting to me was your idea of permeable church is something that we've called blurry edge church.
Wow.
So we kind of hit the ground running in terms of engaging the community. So it was a matter of months when David became the pastor of the church. This is like 27 years ago. It was within a matter of months that just we started to see that our presence in the community was more important than what we were doing on a Sunday morning necessarily. And so it was through a whole series of quite miraculous events that we ended up taking over the management of this disused community centre. And so within months of Dave being a part-time pastor, we were then launching this big community development charity. We didn't know it was going to be big. We didn't know anything. We had no idea. And that grew quite quickly alongside the church, then just becoming much more outward looking. Sounds more like your kind of church. So immediately engaged with needs in its community. And we describe that as blurry edge church. So there's just like loads and loads and loads of ways that our church is present in our community. We've got a community garden. The charity that we set up runs a cafe, a community centre that's open all week. We run a sports field through that charity. Pretty much everything that goes on in this neck of the woods is to do with that charity called BDCA, the Bonnie Downs Community Association. The interesting for us now, I think, is how this all hangs together with the worshipping community. And there's a whole piece of work that we're on now, which is to make sure that these things stay on the same page, because the charity has grown. It employed 100 people last year, which is great in our area. It's doing amazing good. I mean, they're not full-time jobs, but when we waited 10 years to plant a church 3 miles away, and in that time, there's this kind of gravity that happens between Christian ethos charities and a church that then says, oh, well, the charity does that. And yet God was speaking to people in that church, my sister, primarily one of them, and calling them back to feed the poor and to feed the hungry. And then we came back into leadership of that church because we felt that that is what God was saying, that we didn't want to be a church that had set up a fantastic community project. For us, this was our presence in our community. And so it's quite difficult to look ahead and think, how do we want to keep the blurry edges, but how do we keep being held within one vision?
Yeah. Do you have ideas about how do you work at that, or how do you try and do that?
Well, we've done it mainly relationally. So a good proportion of the people employed by the charity are members of the church still, and they don't see that as two separate parts of their life. That's their discipleship. That's how they live as Christians in our community. But it's been a relational understanding, and as the charity's grown, we've started to realise that people don't know the story. And so we've done some stuff with storyboarding and putting visions up on storyboards. We wrote a book to explain our journey. But I think we're also now trying to kind of maybe codify it a bit more and set an ethos to describe what kind of church doesn't want to control what happens in the charitable arm of this thing that we've got going here, but also doesn't want to sort of unplug it from the power source, which has been the Holy Spirit. And we're very inclusive, so we work alongside people of all faiths and no faiths. So it's an interesting thing. I don't know how it's going to work out. You know, we're in that process, trying to get it on paper a little bit, trying to do more than just the ad hoc way that things evolved. Yeah.
I would give almost exactly the same description.
Really?
Yeah. And we're probably in a similar place, and we are trying to figure out how do we structurally add to the relational piece so that they can work together to help keep things.
Yeah. And our ethos has been very much that we don't want to control things. You know, we don't want to be powerful people in our community.
Yep.
We want everybody to feel that they are part of the transformation that's happening here. So we've almost got the opposite problem that lots of churches have, is that we're not into control. We do believe that there's an influence that I have here, which takes some thinking through what the nature of that influence is and how we do that. If Dave and I fell under a bus, is there that ethos that will continue that journey? Or will this charity and church just kind of part company? That's our fear, but we've seen it happen in other places.
Yep.
How are you working that through? Have you got a group of people trying to?
Well, I mean, we have a lot of conversations about it, for one thing. I mean, we use the description of a lot of these initiatives developed under the life of the church or under our one primary charity, Salisbury Community Society. That was the kind of umbrella group that we developed these things. And then we said they're like teenagers, and then they moved out of the family home and built their own home. And we've stayed connected relationally. Often these groups have said that they want to have 1 or 2 seats on their board for members of the church to give kind of a formal relationship and to name that with the other board members. But we're not into control, and we recognize everybody needs to be able to grow in different ways. And so, I mean, there's 2 things we've done. One is we have a lot of the staff are still part of the church, and so that keeps them connected. Secondly, we do a leadership training with all of the staff, and we have a monthly breakfast where we invite all the staff from all the organizations. Not all of them come, but a lot of them do. And we tell stories mostly, and just as a way of having a larger narrative that people can see themselves as a part of. And again, not all the staff are Christians anymore in these organizations. So, we're learning how do we tell the God story with people that aren't part of the, don't see themselves as part of that. So, but it's a learning and growing thing for us, and all that.
Yeah, we did the same stuff. So we started to have a series of kind of socials that we'd invite all the staff to. We've got our office in the community centre rather than in the church building, just to be present. And we have a prayer meeting, but it's quite a contemplative prayer meeting that happens once a week there in the community centre, that people will drop in and out of, just to be more there, really, just to be more present. But it's a difficult journey because I don't see the charitable side of what happens here as evangelism in terms of bringing people into the church. I think it's a kingdom of God movement.
Right.
And I don't want it to be any, to be seen in any kind of agenda that the church has. It's not that.
Right.
There's also this know that the life of transformation is also spiritual as much as it is social and economic here. And we would be, I think we would be robbing our community if we didn't explicitly point out that it's really Jesus's words that are driving us to live this lifestyle. And they can make that what they want, and I wouldn't want to control what they do with that either. But I think we're becoming aware that it's really it's the Jesus and justice movement for us, not just the justice movement for us. And we need to be okay about that. We need to feel ourselves okay about that. So we have a lot in common.
We're at similar kind of stages in the journey, which is interesting, isn't it?
It would be interesting, just in terms of that last little conversation, that because part of this is, in all that you're doing, what are the ways in which you are listening to the movement of God in the stories and the activities of the people you're with? And one of the pieces that I think there is, again, real commonality, Tim, is that, for example, you at Grandview Calvary have been working on how might you form, the language you would use would be a missional order, but it has to do with practices that step into this Jesus thing that Sally's talking about. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I mean, the language of practices was something I kind of discovered when I was doing my doctoral thesis 15 years ago. And I thought, okay, this both describes what we've been trying to do and is helpful language, particularly, in Charles Taylor's words, where you have this nova effect of people's beliefs just, going all over the place. And that if we need common practice to hold us together in this vision, as well as common theological vision and belief. And so we've tried to hold both those together, partly for that reason. So early on, we just named in our home groups that we said 4 practices: prayer, engagement with scripture, commitment to hospitality, and a commitment to justice. And we've said, how do you work those out? And those in our small groups, or in our community houses, we said, these are things we value. Let's work at them. And since then, we've added a few more to call them the 7 seeds of the kingdom: corporate worship, and creation care, and I forget the other one right at the moment. But so we've said these are practices that we want to pursue together, and then that helps people that are coming to be part of the community, especially people who aren't followers of Christ yet, to know, okay, well, this is kind of what these people do. This is what they're on about. And so I can find my entrance points into their life, their way of life together. But it's also helpful for all of us to say, this is a trajectory we're going down. And, you can always go deeper into these practices, and you can reflect on them and then take new steps. And you have to work them out in all areas of our lives and society and so forth. And so, those common practices have been helpful. We've been trying to form some sort of order, monastic order around this, but that's proved to be a little more difficult than we thought, just because it's really valuable for the people who are not part of our church anymore, but that we've sent out. But it's harder for people here because this is just what we do. Turning it into order feels like something extra, that extra job that we don't need for some people, sort of thing. So we're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah. One of the things that we've been hitting on, I mean, we're a very free kind of church in terms of liturgical structure. But something that we've started to do is to not only prepare our sermons in community groups, which has been our practice for years now, but we're trying to write liturgy in community groups. So over Lent, I'm kind of hosting these 3 hours of pretty much just a space, really, with not a whole lot of content, where people can come and have some quiet themselves, because we are a community of activists. So just looking at some quietening practices and contemplative prayer. But then there's the offer to help us to write liturgy that we're going to use on Sundays. And we've been kind of doing that ad hoc, but over Lent, we're going to make this a 3-hour commitment on Thursdays. And I think for me, that's part of the blurring of the edge as well. So there are people in our community who help me write my sermon every week, who have no connection with the church, and yet they will expect me to include their stories. But now we extend that out to prayer as well, and to kind of gather some of the hopes and fears of our people to bring before God on Sunday, whether all of us are there on Sunday or not. So that's part of our blurry edge as well. And I'm stuck within the letting this thing just happen organically, because it's part of who we are, or trying to make it some kind of order, some kind of to capture this thing so that others can maybe understand it, and we can start to speak more confidently about who we are, because we're quite an unusual church.
It's beautiful.
So like tomorrow, it's Ash Wednesday, and I'll be in our food bank, which hosts a community meal for about 40 homeless people. And we have a drop-in for food bank provision. We have an advocacy service. It's really busy. And I'll just be there. And I did this a couple of years ago, and it was so lovely. I just take some tissue paper and some oil. And this is not a Baptist practice, I understand. But I just offer people the chance to write regrets on paper and burn them.
Right.
And then we do something with that ash. So sometimes it does end up becoming crosses on people's heads, or it just becomes a prayer, or it becomes something. And because I'm in that food bank every other week, people expect me as the minister to do something. And this is very, people don't find that intrusive, or it's kind of like, we're giving food, we're giving company, we're giving advocacy, and we're giving prayer, and it's all part of who we are. That's who we are.
Right.
So it's just about us feeling comfortable about it, because actually our community are very, very comfortable with that, and they're from all faiths. So I'll be praying with Muslims and Hindus, and I'll be practicing Ash Wednesday in a kind of a crazy, messy way. But isn't that what you were saying, church in the public square?
Yeah.
It's who we are.
That's great. That's great.
One of the things that I'd really love to hear each of you talk about and interact with each other about is that you're going to get some background noise right now that I don't have any control of, so I'll just own that.
Not bad.
It's called Garbage Collection Day. But you are both in the public space. You're both in the local, in the neighborhood. And I was talking to a friend yesterday, and he was about a lot of churches that he is connected with, this is in Europe, have sort of caught on to the local. And as you both know, being in the neighborhood is now the new thing. And that, but he says when he listens to them, what he hears, particularly around practices, are things like they're talking to God. God, here's what we're doing, bless us. God, Lord, here's what we're doing, tweak it a bit and make it work. But what tends not to be happening is how they are listening to the stories of the people in the neighborhood. And in that listening to the stories, not so much talking to God as listening to what God is saying and up to in ways that can be quite disruptive. And I wonder what your experiences are there, whether you have you could share stories about that or illustrations about that, or does that make sense what I'm just describing? Who'd like to go first?
I think there's a personal aspect to a spirituality that will listen. And then there's how you make that part of your community's life. So I've told you a few things, how we make that part of our community's life. We cook our sermons in community conversations. We write liturgy, midweek ministries, and we bring them back to Sunday. But I think probably there's been something missing from Western spirituality generally, which is not to have this kind of transactional prayer life. And I think people are recovering more of a sense of contemplative prayer, of just being quiet in God's presence and letting that be the prayer. And I kind of lent into that. We had a really profound bereavement in our family a couple of years ago. And it was at that point that I realised that I needed deeper roots personally into faith. I needed to lean right into God, and I didn't have the words to say, and I didn't want to hear answers. I just wanted to be held, I guess. So I started that practice myself on Thursday mornings, and that's been a significant part of my life that I'm now trying to share in terms of offering other Christians to come and do that with me on Thursday evenings. And it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, but it's an agenda-free encounter with God. I think that's what you're getting at. It's not praying so that I'll have the answer to know how to do something, or praying for somebody's problem. It's more just being there myself with God and attempting to hear well, just to have Jesus' presence around me, I think. But that's been new for me, so I understand why others are not there yet and have lots of different ways to kind of hear God. And I'm not saying they're not hearing God, but for me there was a depth that was brought to me by this kind of deep sense that I knew I really did need to be held at that point in my life. Yeah. How about you, Tim?
Yeah, well, I think one of the significant developments over the past 15 years in the life of our community has been the practice of listening prayer. And so that has shaped our worship, where we often, in response to teaching and preaching, will have a time of listening and then invite people to respond to that. It's changed our church meetings for sure, because we, instead of just following Robert's Rules of Order, we have switched to, adapted that to have a listening prayer time, whatever the big issue is we're focusing on, and that trying to figure out as a community. And so we'll take 5 to 10 minutes of silence and listening, and then people will share out of that space about what they believe God is leading us to. And that practice of listening, as in all worship practices, to one extent, we hope will form us to listen to our neighbors and to listen to the culture. And so I think that does make a difference and has made a difference. And we're so aware that we're, in a post-Christian neighborhood, in a secular neighborhood. I mean, that was true when I first came 30 years ago. And so it was the most kind of, had the highest percentage of people who identified themselves as not having the belief in God. And so that was there then already, and suspicion towards the church. And so we've always recognized we're marginal, kind of on the edge of culture that way. And we need to listen just for that reason alone. And I think, Al, you were going to say something there.
No.
I think too, another practice that's really been helpful is when we interview people in our worship, we often interview them like, how are you trying to work this out in your life and in your engagements and involvement? And then there's both a learning from each other and a listening to each other in those ways, but also a practice that we recognize, that working out the way of the kingdom is really an art, and there is this sense of improvisation and trying to figure out what it looks like. And so I think people carry that kind of orientation into how they're trying to live out their faith and life, in the whole of their lives.
I like that. I think we're a church that doesn't we don't tend towards pat answers, and we're not a church that packages up, you know, kind of here is the answer to this and here. I think our church is messy because lots of our people's lives, Eastern people are very honest about the mess in their life. They don't have the kind of facade that other groups have. So sometimes it's my job is to try to package it a little bit, and I try not to let the whole thing spill out. But we have that naturally, culturally. We're very open people and share. And I think that it's been good that leaders in the church have done that, have admitted when they're struggling with things and when they're out and working through some of the difficult things that happen. So I think we share that, and yeah, we don't interview into it. We do have testimonies that we weave into sermon series, but I guess for us, we always make sure that whoever's preaching has at least 2 community conversations, and we try to make that with people within the congregation, but also outside, to ask them, what do you think God is saying? Story, what questions would you ask? What should I be asking? And I really like that. It takes time, but it's a lovely practice, and we call it cooking a sermon.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why it's cooking, but it's that process of, you know, it takes time to cook a meal from scratch. That's different from throwing something in the microwave, right? And I guess this is like how the Word of God, we encounter that in our community, is it happens in the food bank, in conversations with people. And then it might be that I might talk in my staff room, you know, I'm a sociology lecturer, about some of the issues that are being raised. And then it could be a conversation with a group of women, and, you know, I go to different kinds of groups and share. So over 3 or 4 weeks, this thing will be cooking and stewing down. And I believe then that when we present that in the church, we're genuinely trying to do that capturing of what God is saying to us, to particularly us. That's one thing I found really helpful.
You should write something up about how you do sermons, because that's really interesting. I don't think that's common for sure. And I feel like even listening to you, I think there's things I could learn or we could learn from you. So I hope you write something up about that.
Well, most people do it afterwards. You know, most churches, if they have a small church program, you have the sermon and then everybody looks for the application. And I think I hit upon it. I think it was like a liberation theology influence for me, this idea of learning communities.
Yeah.
I love a sermon. You know, I love a sermon. I hear God through preaching, and we honoured the place of preaching in our church, but we didn't want it to be a hierarchical thing. So we're always a team teaching approach, but how do you get beyond those who are gifted to preach? Well, I think that you can do it through that process of sermon cooking. And sometimes I'm forever throwing about bits of flip chart and writing random stuff, you know, and so it'll be part of, and then it all comes into a notebook, and then this thing that's been hours and hours of conversation becomes a 25-minute sermon.
Right.
Yeah.
Part of what you are both describing, at least from my listening, is that in each of your contexts, it's not as if primarily you stepped into your communities with a plan and a strategy. You lived and dwelt, and as an older friend of mine described, you became what he called detectives of divinity. You were listening and attending, trying to test out what is God doing. And it gets back to what I said earlier, is that this is not about saying to God, here's what we've got planned, bless it. It's how do we listen to what God is doing and joining there. And I wonder what you'd want to, what is it? How, in what ways have you heard God speaking and addressing to you as a community out of those activities? And part of my reason for asking that is, as I said, you've got a whole, the new movement is neighborhood, and lots of books are being written about it. And if you read those books, so many of them are tactical. They really do ooze, here's how to get the right outcomes. which at the end of the day are all about we can still be in control and manage what we want. You're describing something very different, in which God is, I'll use my language, but you allowing God to mess with you and come present amongst you. Can you, if that makes sense, can you talk about that a little bit? And are there stories that you could give that illustrate that?
Go for it, Tim.
I'm thinking about some stories. The way I sometimes again describe my own journey is, Tom Wright was such an influence on me in my seminary days. And I had a chance to study with him twice personally, and just really shaped my vision and understanding of the New Testament and of Jesus. But most of my seminary training was just along the lines of what you said not to do, basically, Al, which is to come in with a strategy. Here's the strategy, here's the plan. And it was all about Christendom, still about, here's how you do Christian education, here's how people will come, and here's how you just do the things you need to do to have the program. And when I came, particularly with that vision of the kingdom of God, how does the church bear witness to the kingdom of God and live this out? I recognized that most of what I learned in seminary wasn't going to be very fruitful or helpful for that. And so I was just, I said I came with a theological vision of the church bearing witness to the kingdom, but I had no idea how to work that out, really. And the skills I needed to learn, I learned while I was pastoring, not at seminary. And so many of those skills are the listening kinds of pieces. But the first thing I went to was I went to the monthly gathering of people who worked in the neighborhood, so social services, education, and health. And I came to that monthly meeting where they talked about issues in the neighborhood. And at first they were suspicious, what's a Baptist pastor doing here? But then I listened for a long time. And then 10 years later, I became the chair. Partly because I wasn't fighting for the same funding they all were, and so I could navigate, negotiate, and help heal wounds between people and so forth. But that we also gained trust over those 10 years. People recognized that we were there for the good of the neighborhood too, and so.
Well, 10 years means you're there.
What's that?
I say 10 years means you're there.
Right. Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
not a project.
And so that was a significant development for developing trust, and then working, like you say, Sally, with whoever in the neighborhood, wherever we can, wherever we have common, ground, we work together. And so that's been significant. I think in the past 10 years, some of the significant things are like, for me personally, it's been a relationship with the guy I'm having coffee with tomorrow. He's a professor at SFU, or one of our major universities, and he's a big shot. He's written about the city and how the cities work and so forth. And yet he's been a community activist, and he's lived with people in his home. Like, it's been a life. His life parallels Mary's and my life in so many ways. And we've started to have a conversation about, what is the gospel? And he feigns that he doesn't know anything about it, but he studied with Ivan Illich for 2 years, so I know he knows something about faith. And we're having these great conversations, and he said to me the other day, he said, Tim, if other churches would like yours, I'd have a lot of faith more faith in the church. And I said, if academics were more like you, I'd have more faith in the university. And so, but a lot of people in our church are having those kinds of conversations with their neighbors. And that to me I love those kinds of conversations because they're real. And like you say, Sally, they're not, because you have trust and longevity, it's not a strained kind of thing like, oh, you're talking about religion, we don't talk about religion. It's just, we're talking about life, and it's about sharing our lives and stories. And I love those kinds of conversations. Matt asked me last Easter, he said, like, Tim, I don't get it. What's Easter about it? And I said, well, part of it is, that Jesus' resurrection affirms that injustice and hatred doesn't have the last word, that God is doing something to overcome that. And he says, oh, well, happy Easter. And you know, it's I love those kinds of conversations, and the more that we can have those kind of conversations, a real exchange with our neighbors and learning, and yet offering something, I feel like that's hopeful for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe one thing we've got in common is I would be a member of this community, whether I was a pastor here or not, whether I was a minister.
Right.
This is my community. And I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, it's not the same for everyone. They're not going to stay put for 25 years in one church. But I think I would have a very different engagement with my neighbourhood if I wasn't primarily part of this community anyway.
Right.
You know, if I was like a professional Christian come to grow a church, I think I would feel differently about the conversations, and I would be seen differently by people. So people know me as Ellen's daughter. You know, my mum's been here, part of the community, which is fine by me. That is who, you know, that's who I am. I'm not the minister. I'm a leader within this community in terms of theology, I guess, and being a community theologian. That's how I like to see myself. But I'm here anyway. And, you know, we often dream about the super pastor who's going to come in and be able to do this stuff because we don't know what we've been doing for 30 years. And it's a bit of a dream sometimes, you know, that somebody will come in to do this better. But I would be here anyway. And the other thing about having open and intelligent conversations, I think you have to get away from some of the churchianity and the denominational kinds of blinkers that some ministers put on. You know, I didn't go to a seminary. I did my theology with a philosophy degree. And that was a huge benefit to me because I could engage with other streams of Christianity. You know, my doctoral stuff was on Karl Rahner, you know, Jesuit Catholicism.
Yeah.
I think that gave me a breadth in my thinking that had I come through a more traditional ministerial route, I wouldn't think that lecturing in sociology was a good part of my life, but it's a fantastic part of my life. You know, the scholarship that I do there is immediately relevant to what God says in my community. So I think there's something kind of missing in the way we imagine leadership that almost sets people at a disadvantage because they're kind of approaching a community with a certain hat on already. You know, they're the minister. Now, people in my community do think of me as their minister, but not just their minister, you know, or not in that distant way. I think that's what staying put for a long time means. People get to know you very well. They see you on your rough days. They see your family grow. They see all the things that happen to you. You know, it's not so distant. It's more an integrated stance. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I mean, that's my experience. I mean, at times it is a bit much, and that's partly my own workaholic thing. And I mean, just I told Al this, but like on 2 months ago, I visited somebody in the hospital, stopped to have something to eat, drank too much, and drove home and had an accident. And so, I mean, it's the whole church and the whole neighborhood basically knows about it because I had the accident, walked from my home, just hit a tree.
Oh,
And so,
that's
I mean,
part of the problem of dwelling in your neighborhood there, Tim.
exactly. So it's been interesting, again, the response of people in our church has been, you know, really beautiful. But the neighborhood response has been really significant, where a lot of people who came to me for, you know, care and help and advice now are coming by offering their care and advice and help, like they want to give something. And to me, there's a health in that. I mean, I wish I hadn't done that, but there's a health in that kind of mutuality.
Yeah.
That has been really good. And so, yeah, there's a humanness to all this, isn't there? I mean, my own brokenness, and yet we have real relationships together.
Yeah.
In the midst of all of that, the humanness, the presence, the sitting with the SFU prof or the person down the street in conversation around sermons, what how do I frame this question? Is that what is it in each of your settings that you are hearing, which I don't mean by big voice, but you're hearing, what is God fermenting and bubbling out ahead of you in your neighborhoods? What are you hearing about that? And I'm not asking the analysis question of, if you do a good social analysis of the demographics and the shifts and the dynamics, all of that. But underneath all of that, are there ways in which, in your particular context, you're hearing God out ahead of you saying, here's where you need to be? If that's an obtuse question, just say so and I'll change.
No. It's Lent, and so for me, I think I'm in a community of activists, and I sense God's call is for our church to be a place where people can encounter God in quietness, which is really not our church at the moment. You know, we're busy and messy and full on, but it's a personal sense within me, but also I think something that God's asking of us. So I get that sense that we probably need to look at our practices together, if you like, that would include encouraging people to experience God quietly and to listen to God. I think God is saying that to us. On another level, I also believe that God is saying to us that our church will probably need to get back into shared living and to kind of go up a gear in terms of the shared lives of the people at the core of the church. So interesting to hear what you're saying, Tim, about your housing project. That's a dream for us, you know, to convert our the building that we do own in this community to have some kind of communal living space, some kind of shared. I'd love a place that was communal living for some, but also like a front room for the rest of us, so that we could spend more of our lives together. I think it's almost like going up in terms of commitment to one another, but also quietening down in terms of the way we're expressing ourselves before God. I don't know what others in my community would say, but that's what I think.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think holding all those together, like a shared life, a deeper shared life, a deeper engagement with our neighbors, and deeper engagement with God. I mean, that seems to be the challenge, but how holding those together in right balance is often we find tricky for sure as a community. I mean, I mean, I've really been influenced again by Charles Taylor, and I see this in the stories, and I listen to our neighborhood. Like, there was a woman she identifies as transgender. They came to our church 2 years ago, and Bunny came in our newcomers class. She said, I don't know what's going on here at this church, and I'm not a Christian, but I've seen what this church is doing. I've got to figure out what's going on here. And you know, she didn't come because she was looking for a good worshiping community. She was looking for a meaning in her life, and she was part of an activist community. And she said, everybody's angry at each other, and you're not angry with each other. And I'm trying to figure out that too, like what's going on here that's different.
Yeah.
And you know, she became part of our newcomers class and exploring faith, and gave this rousing testimony at her baptism that surprised even me. and yet she's really pressed us around transgender issues, and you know, we're trying to listen to her and to really clearly, and it's challenging, you know, and but that practice of listening to, like, so I feel like she's emblematic of a lot of people in our neighborhood who are looking for purpose. Like, secularism isn't doing it for them. Like, they know there are these impulses towards transcendence and towards something more, and we need to be there in those conversations, like talking about what the more can be. At the same time, you know, as followers of Christ, our temptation is towards self-sufficiency and management, you know, and so I feel like we have to work at both ends, challenging followers of Christ not to slip into those mastering kind of elements. If we just have the right technique, we can make everything happen in the world, to but at the same time for our secular friends to say, you know, there really is some greater thing here going on in the world. And I love David Bentley Hart's quote. He says, our mastery over technology and science has given us the delusion of the mastery over reality itself. And we live with that kind of thing as Christians. And so working at both those has been important.
That is, this is, thank you both. It's slipping back into the leadership piece, because a lot of people listening to this are in that space, is that my awareness at a whole variety of levels is how difficult it is for a lot of leaders, particularly in congregations filled with anxiety about success and everything else, how difficult it is to step beyond and outside of the need to manage and control the outcomes that are needed. We do a lot of work in our organization and community with how in congregations people might begin simply listening to others in the neighborhood. And it is stunning as we do reflection on this, the very, very high numbers of these people for whom listening to the other makes absolutely no sense unless it has an outcome attached to it.
Wow.
Well, that's the reality. And that if it doesn't have an outcome attached to it, it doesn't make sense. And yet what you're describing is that it is in fact in the listening to the other that this, I would say, mysterious space is created in which God is present and turns up. That's what I hear you describing. But part of what I would press is that is a huge ask to ask many leaders. It is a, it's like asking me to go naked. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So linked for me to those, what you're saying, Al, is the 7-year plan or the 3-year plan to turn a church around.
Yeah.
I mean, I just don't think that's realistic, that way of thinking anymore. You know, for one thing, it may or may not happen. There's so many factors that
right. Yeah.
come into that.
Yeah.
And so if you're not there with the kind of monastic vision of I'm going to be here and take up this way of life with these people, we'll see what happens, versus the kind of the pragmatic, rule, I just don't see how you can do what you need to do. Yeah.
I thoroughly understand. It's that, and this is because our hour's up, but this is a whole other conversation which I'd love to have, which is how might you invite, I'm not asking for answers right now, but how might you invite leaders who hear what you're describing, who are, and I think it's the majority, who wrestle with the defaults of, if I don't have an ROI, a return on investment, and if I don't have a strategy to show my people and a vision to point, I am nothing. Or, I mean, what I hear a lot of pastors say to me is, if I started doing what Tim and Sally are doing in their places, I'll be out of a job. Those are some of the deep pieces. And yet, what I hear you both saying is that in your locations, what you're hearing God saying is slow, go deeper, attend, be present. It's in these kind of very, very ordinary practices that, to use your language, Tim, the kingdom keeps turning up. Yeah. Well, thank you both. This, for me, is very rich. And you're both, and I mean this, you're both such wonderfully, incredibly creative people. I just keep scratching my head at how could two Baptists do this in two different parts of the world?
It's amazing. It makes you believe in God when two
It
Baptists.
makes you believe in God. God's great, wonderful sense of humor.